Today's your lucky day. You get to pick between two tests. Test number 1, exhaust. 3 different configurations. Configuration number 1, long tube headers, collector extension, complete 2.5-inch exhaust from hooker all the way out to the tailpipes. Configuration number 2, same long tube headers, collector extension, and 3-inch dyno mufflers with no other exhaust. Configuration number 3, we ditch the dyno mufflers. 3 configurations, which one makes the most power? Test number 2, long tube headers versus shorty headers on a supercharged LS. That's right, we're going to run long tube headers versus shorty headers on a twin screw supercharged LS3. So which test do you want? What the heck? Let's do them both. Our first test was an exhaust comparison. We wanted to compare the way that we normally run an LS motor on the engine dyno to the way that a guy runs it in the car with a complete exhaust system. Lucky for us, the dyno facility at Westech, their dyno room, the engine dyno room, actually allowed us to install a complete exhaust from the headers all the way back to the tailpipe. So the guys at Hooker supplied a C10 LS swap kit. Now that allowed us to run a 2.5-inch exhaust all the way back to the tailpipes and compare that to the way that we normally run it. When we run it, we usually run long tube headers, a 3-inch collector extension that's about 18 inches long, and then sometimes we'll run our MagnaFlow 3-inch straight through mufflers for the dyno. Sometimes we'll run it without mufflers, but I like to run it with mufflers. It's a lot easier to work with, but sometimes we run it with, sometimes we run it without, so we decided to test both of those in this test. Test number 2 was designed to illustrate the power gains offered by long tube headers on a supercharged LS. Now we all know long tube headers work well on an NA application, but what about on a supercharged combination? I mean, the supercharged combination makes more power. Are headers worth even more on a more powerful supercharged combination? To find out, I set up a Kenny Bell supercharged LS3 motor. We ran long tube headers and shorty headers. Let's find out how they did and the changes in the boost curve. Our first exhaust test was actually run on a 383 stroker, which is a 5.3 liter block with a 4-inch stroke crank in it. It had 6125 rods in it, and then we bore out that block to a 3905 bore. So the combination produces like 383 inches. It was equipped with a set of TFS 225, the Gen X heads, which flow really well, and a healthy cam as a crane, 624 lift, 232, 242 degree duration, 112 degree lobe separation angle. You can kind of see all the specs here. I kind of left that up on the notes description here. But it had a fast LSXR intake manifold and the matching throttle body. And the first thing we did was run this thing with a full exhaust, because that's always one of the questions that people ask when we're running stuff on the engine dynos. Yeah, you guys run that with long tube headers and short collector extensions, and then usually mufflers. I like running mufflers because it makes the thing a lot quieter. It's a lot easier to live with. But what I wanted to do, and since the Westech dyno facility allows for like a full exhaust to be run, we don't often do it, but we could do it. So I did it on this one. So what I did was get I got an exhaust from the guys at Hooker, and it's designed for an LS swap in a C10 truck, but it's a full exhaust and it's 2.5-inch. Now what I wanted to do was compare this full exhaust, this full 2.5-inch exhaust with mufflers and tailpipes and all that. We want to compare it to the exhaust the way that we normally run on the dyno, which is a 18-inch, 3-inch diameter collector extension. And then even if we run mufflers on it, we've got a set of MagnaFlow mufflers that are kind of straight through. So they're a good performance muffler, and they usually don't cost any power. So run with the full C10 swap exhaust on our 383, on our modified 383. This motor produced with this exhaust, with this full exhaust, 542 horsepower and 503 foot-pounds of torque. So here's what happened after we installed our dyno exhaust, which is basically the same long tube headers. Now we ran long tube headers on this. Long tube headers, 3-inch exhaust, just a collector extension, and those MagnaFlow dyno mufflers. So you can see it picked up a little bit of power with the free-flowing exhaust. Power jumped up to 548, so you're talking about a gain of 6 horsepower, and peak torque was only up by a couple of foot-pounds to 507 foot-pounds. Now occasionally we'll run long tube headers and just the collector extensions with no exhaust. So here's what happened when we did that. Basically all we did was remove the mufflers. So here's what happened when we remove the mufflers, and it's not a big change. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the full exhaust so we can kind of see a bigger difference between the two. But if we look at the muffler no muffler test, we can see that the no muffler test picked up a little bit of power at the top, made 551 horsepower. So that's a gain of about 3 horsepower, which, you know, in the grand scheme of things, with as much power as this thing makes, it's not a big change. But what I want you to look at is here in the middle from 45 to 5500, and then down below that, down in the 4300 and lower range, having no muffler on there actually changed the shape of the curve. So having the muffler on there actually improved the low speed power, which is something that we see. And this has nothing to do with the flow rate of the exhaust, because a lot of people want to attribute everything to maximum flow. Oh, that's a bigger exhaust, it flows more. And that's part of it on a full exhaust. But down here, we're actually dealing with a scavenging effect of the length of the collector extension. Because up to a certain length, the collector extension will change the shape of the power curve, same way that long runners do on an intake manifold. So this is a scavenging effect. We probably could have done the same thing, and I apologize for not doing it. I should have just stuck another length of collector extension on this to mimic what the muffler was, because that's what we did. We didn't really change the flow so much, because a flow thing we would see at the top of the RPM range. But down here, what you're seeing is the scavenging effect, and it's just the added length of the muffler to the exhaust system, which is kind of cool. So we saw gains down here, down low, 7 foot-pounds down there, and here in the middle also we saw a change of 505 to 509. So got another 3 or 4 foot-pounds. Again, it's not a ton in the grand scheme of things given what this thing produces, but those are the change offered by exhaust system changes on a naturally aspirated motor. So now let's take a look at what happened when I did a header test versus long tubes versus shorties on a supercharged combination. Test motor number 2 was actually an LS3 crate motor. Now we did have a cam in it and a Kenny-Bill supercharger, and we were going to use it to compare shorty headers versus long tube hooker headers on a supercharged combination. And right off the bat, there are 2 things that are amazingly wrong with this test. First of all, we had a cathedral port cam with rec port heads. We had a comp 54-459-11 camshaft, and as you can see, it's a cathedral port cam, and we had it on our LS3 with rec port heads. And we also had an NA cam on a supercharged application, so it was definitely the wrong cam. In fact, it was the wrong cam. But as we'll see, it works out just fine. So what we did was run the LS3 with the Kenny-Bill supercharger, and we ran it first with a set of JBA shorty, basically truck headers. And then we ran it again with long tube headers that we normally run. They're a hooker 1 7/8 swap header. So here's what happened when we ran our cammed LS3 with the Kenny-Bill supercharger. And I'll go ahead and show you the boost curves after this to show you what happened to the boost when we did the header test. So equipped with the shorty headers, our supercharged LS3 produced 706 horsepower. And we won't take the spike way down here at the bottom. We'll take something here in the middle. 632 foot-pounds of torque. So here's what happened after we installed the long tube headers. See, we picked up a fair bit of power and power through most of the curve, which was nice. Peak power jumped to 724 horsepower, and peak torque was up to 645 foot-pounds. As you can see, through most of the curve, the headers offered, pretty solid gains compared to the shorty headers. Now, on a supercharged application, obviously exhaust flow would be even more important. So stock exhaust manifolds and shorty headers, maybe not an ideal way to go. But actually, I was expecting a little more power in this. But now let's take a look at the boost curves associated with our header swap here. After looking at the power results, you think, yeah, putting headers on should add power to it. And we would expect that long tube headers over shorty headers. We normally pick up power, so why not? Why wouldn't it pick up power on the supercharged application? But here's the interesting thing. If we take a look at the boost curve, this is the boost curve offered by the shorty headers. And if we take a look at the boost curve offered by the long tube headers in red here, we see that the boost was actually slightly higher with the long tube headers. Now, normally what you would find is when you make a change and it makes more power on a supercharged application, usually that comes with a drop in boost. Now, it might not do that on a turbo application, which is kind of self-compensating, but on a centrifugal blower or a roots blower or twin screw blower like this one, we would normally see a drop in boost because the combination gets more efficient. And since boost is just basically back pressure, the measurement of back pressure that's not allowed to flow through the motor properly, when we improve the efficiency, it normally decreases boost. So we get more power at a lower boost level, which is good. But in this case, that didn't happen. So the long tube headers definitely made power, but they, for some reason, did it with a little bit more boost. And not a lot. I mean, we're talking about 2 or 3/10 of a pound, so the change wasn't great. But this is why we test. This is why I don't go into a test always knowing what's going to happen. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what did you think about our exhaust test? Well, here's my takeaway. When we made this exhaust test, we basically changed 2 things. And there are 2 things to think about when you're talking about exhaust flow. One is the diameter of the exhaust. Obviously, now we went from a 2.5-inch full exhaust down to a 3-inch shortened exhaust. So that's the other thing. It's diameter and its length. Because for any given diameter, if we increase the length, we decrease flow. So the longer it is, especially if it has more bends and it has mufflers in it, the flow rate of the exhaust is gonna go down. So shorter is better and bigger is better in terms of flow. So on this exhaust test, we shortened it dramatically and we went up in diameter. So we made basically a big change. The ideal situation would be to run a full exhaust that's 3 inches. That way we could see the intermediate between those two. But here's what I want you to take away. Given the what I would call minimal difference in power between our shortened 3-inch exhaust compared to the full length 2.5-inch exhaust, I don't think that there's too much to be gained there. I think if we put a full 3-inch system, we would get 90 to 95% of what we get when we run our shortened system on the engine dyno. So full exhaust, not a problem. And the other thing to think about is if we're making more power than we made with our test motor, I mean, our 383 was a good motor, but it was only making about 540 horsepower. If you were making 600 or 700 or 800 horsepower, the flow needs of your exhaust are going to go up. So make sure you have enough exhaust flow, but for most cases in this kind of NA deal for an LS motor, 2.5 or 3-inch, no problem. What about our test on the long tube headers versus shorty headers on a supercharged combination? Any surprises there? I mean, headers usually make power, but usually the long tube headers add power from scavenging. In my opinion, I want you guys to let me know in the comments what you guys think, but in my opinion, the long tube headers don't add as much scavenging on this combination because most positive displacement superchargers rely on very short runner intakes. And so the long tube header has to work with a long runner intake to optimize scavenging, because scavenging, all it does is help draw more air into the combustion chamber. That's how scavenging works. And I think that the two would work better if they're tuned the same. So we need long runners working with long runner headers. And I'll try to figure that out later on, because I want to run a combination where we run a centrifugal supercharger blowing through a factory long runner style intake like a FAST or a TBSS, and see if it's more or less receptive to headers. Let me know what you guys think. Will we see more gains there? Despite that, we saw some pretty good gains here even with this combination. The long tube headers, the engine 7/8 headers, were definitely worth power over the shorty headers. Now, it's also important to point out that the shorty headers relied on a smaller diameter exhaust after the header. So basically, everything was more restrictive. Less flow, less power, no big surprise. I'm Richard Holder, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. More testing coming up.